Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are on top of the world having a good time because last week we just got to connect with people who listen to this podcast, people just like you. We did 2 stops. We were driving up north on the East Coast of the United States, and we stopped in Atlanta and Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. So Atlanta, Georgia, and Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. And that was really fun to be able to talk to people in real time, not just speak into a microphone and then have people make comments, but actually talk to people just like yourself and have an evening of conversation, of getting to know each other. And it was, it was just an amazing experience for me. And I think it was for you too, Antonia.
Yeah, definitely. And we had really good turnouts. I think both places combined somewhere between like 75 and 100 people came out, and from really far away. Somebody drove from Tampa, Florida to go to the Atlanta, Georgia meetup.
It was like a 7-hour drive for them, something like that.
Yeah, which was it was flattering, and it was really cool to be able to connect with a lot of people.
Yeah, people drove in from 2 hours away, 3 hours away, all over the Southeast, basically, for both meetups. And I just want to give a quick shout out to our host, Betsy, and her husband, Randy, who helped us host in Atlanta. A big thank you to them. Betsy's one of our profiler training students that connected us in the area. And then a big shout out to Colin and Deanna Crossman, who own 2 different boutique hotel inns actually the one we did this at was in Cary, North Carolina, at the Mayton Inn, which if you're ever through that area, it's a beautiful place to stay. Make sure you look up the Mayton Inn because you will not be disappointed. Colin and Deanna do a wonderful job of hosting and making it feel really comfortable there. So we just want to give shout outs to both of those couples for hosting us in those cities. And, in the future, depending on when you hear this, we might be coming to a city near you. So be keeping your eyes out. And if you want us to come to a city near you, reach out to us. Let us know where you're at. And if we can get enough people together, we'd love to come do a meetup. We actually ended up doing an impromptu, I'll call it Q&A. It wasn't a plan. We were just going to go and just hang out. But people were like, can you answer some questions? So we did this little gathering impromptu Q&A at both locations, which was fun too. So we got to do a little of a formal structure, and then we also just got to talk to people, which anytime I get to connect with you listening, that makes me feel, I think for you too, Antonia, that makes us feel like it's like a shot in the arm of energy. So, and out of that, when we were in these 2 formats, we got a lot of questions around business, around careers, obviously around typology and systems and frameworks and things like that, but a lot of business career advice on, how do I make things happen business-wise, career-wise, in my life. And we were thinking today this would be a great topic to expand upon because we got so many questions in both locations that there's got to be more people out there that want to hear about this. So today we want to talk about, depending on your personality type, and we'll break this down in this podcast, but based on who you are and how you're wired and your personality, how do you best bring things into the world? How do you best bring projects, whether it's an entire business you're starting up or a project at work or something in your personal life at your home? How do you bring that into the world? And what do you watch out for that might trip you up or stop you from bringing that thing into the world? And, based on how you're wired, how are you going to show up the best to do that?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is to remember that we're talking about projects and bringing things into the world, not necessarily specifically career advice, because as easy as it is in theory to tell you what to do in your career, when it comes to individuals, there are so many different components that it's hard to say, this is the career you should be doing as your personality type.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of potential careers that each personality type could be engaged in, but there are overall principles for how to get things done, how to get those projects handled. What are some of the things to look out for depending upon your personality type that might make it so that projects are particularly difficult to accomplish or to get your ideas from, inside your mind into the outside world. And we're going to split it into 4 primary categories. Think of them as just the bread and the sandwich of the 4-letter code in Myers-Briggs. We're going to talk about EPs and IPs and EJs and IJs. So if you find yourself in one of those 4 categories, we're going to have some basic advice for your personality type to make sure that you can actually accomplish the things you want to accomplish and not fall for some of the basic trip-ups that people of your similar type might experience.
Now, if you're new to this, there's a lot of letters flying around all the time, right? There's the 4-letter code in the Myers-Briggs system, and then we've talked about cognitive functions, which have letters to them. There's the Cursian temperaments, which have letter combinations. What Antonia is actually talking about here, the letter combinations, is that 4-letter code. So I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, taking the first letter and the last letter, EP. So when she says EP, you ignore the middle 2 letters. You recognize the first letter and the last letter is what we're talking about in this framework specifically today.
So let's get started. Let's talk about the first batch. What are some of the things let's take the one that seems like the easiest. Let's talk about EJs. How do EJs get things done in the outside world? And what are some of the things that they have to watch out for and not get tripped up by things that are, quirks of their personality? So there are 4 EJ types: ENTJs, ESTJs, ENFJs, and ESFJs. And these are the types that the rest of us, like the other 12 types, look at and go, you don't have any problem in getting anything done. You guys seem to be very good at marking things off of the to-do list. And so for EJs, it's almost like, well, do they even need advice? They're so good at getting things done. And while that is true, they are usually quite motivated to get things accomplished in the outside world. Some of the things that they have to look out for are not getting things done, but getting things done sustainably. Getting things done that actually accomplish their end game goals. Now, one of the things that all EJs have in common is that they're going to share very similar dominant functions or driver processes. They're going to share, the ENTJ and ESTJ will share extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, as their driver or dominant process. And ENFJs and ESFJs will use extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, as their driver or dominant process. And so both of these are processes that are extroverted. So they look to the outside world as their primary world that they like to engage in. And they're both what are technically called judging processes, or we call them decision-making processes. And so since they're all EJs are pointing their decision-making or evaluation and judging into the outside world, one of the things that they all 4 have in common is that they're pretty sure they know how things should be operating. They're pretty sure they know how things should be done. And since they rest into that concept, the reason why they're so good at getting things done is because they notice when it's not being done the way that they think it should be. Right? Like if an EJ sees something going undone, or something in the wrong place, or somebody's doing something in a way that they think that they shouldn't be doing that thing, they are driven by their dominant process to go do something about it, or at least say something, or somehow make it different, make it more how they believe that thing should be done. So that's a drive of theirs. As a dominant process, they get intrinsic reward for, and I'm going to use the word manipulate in the best way possible, by manipulating the outside world to match what they think is very obvious in how the world should be operating. So they get an intrinsic reward for that, and that's one of the reasons why they are, of all of the types, some of the most famously industrious.
So as an EJ, when you're bringing projects into the world, you probably have a sense of, hey, I know how this should be working. I know how we should connect all these pieces. Whether you are an ESFJ or ENFJ, where you're looking at the people components, I think these people need to talk to each other. I think we need to make these relationships work over here. I need the office set up in this dynamic so people can connect with each other. And then we need to bring the project forward in this fashion. Or if you're an ENTJ or ESTJ and you're looking at the structural element of things, you're like, okay, we need this process put in place, or this project needs these elements and these resources dedicated to it. You're so good at moving fast and getting things done and accomplished. One of the challenges you may have as an EJ is moving without having everybody that's part of that project bought in. So one of the earlier challenges you can have, you move forward and not everyone is on the same page. They may need more time to catch up or to get all of the things together to come to the same conclusions that you've come to. Now, this is assuming you've come to the right conclusions and you're doing the best thing in the first place, which is a whole nother part of this. But one thing you're going to need to do when you're bringing projects, because that commanding nature you have as an EJ is so powerful, and usually you've got a pretty good sense of what has to happen. Getting consensus is going to be one of the things that's frustrating your ability to get projects into the outside world, getting people on board and supporting that effort or cause.
EJs are usually really good at mobilizing people. So even if you don't have everybody on board, I find that EJs can usually get people to do it anyway, even if those people are grumbling or don't necessarily want to be on the train, but they've all of a sudden found themselves on the train. So I think that happens a lot. But to speak to the second thing that you mentioned, which was part of the component, which is assuming that the EJ is correct in their assumption of what needs to happen or how it needs to happen, I think the second piece is making sure that the EJ is checking in with that Copilot process of either introverted sensing or memory or introverted intuition or perspectives, making sure that they're checking in with that secondary process to get all the information needed. It's very seductive for EJs to simply mobilize, to be in motion, and slowing down is never fun. For an EJ, slowing down feels like a waste of time, and there's always so much to do and so little time. So this idea of like slowing down enough to take in a bigger picture or to take in more information or to go check sources or to make sure that there's a template for this, that's not always fun. Oftentimes they just want to push their way through. So for an EJ, they might end up unfortunately making more messes with their solutions. Their solutions might create more problems. But that's, you get into this modality where you're not really seeing that. And so you're just in this hamster wheel of constantly correcting problems, not really recognizing that short-sightedness is causing more of them than it's solving. So I think for EJs, it's slowing down and taking in more information and maybe checking in with other people. That's usually the thing that blindsides them in projects, not getting them done, but maybe not getting them done as well as they could have been accomplished.
Yeah. And the other thing, you take the input from other people, but often if you are right on the right track and you know what needs to happen, you might actually be seeing a pretty big picture. And people need a lot of context and a lot of hand-holding through the process. You might see the start, the middle, and the finish, but the people you're leading in that project or working alongside may only see one piece of it, like the start, for example. They don't see where you're going to end up. And there might be some reluctance or some confusion or some sluggishness or slowness to get that project done because they need a lot of context for why you're doing it this way. It seems so obvious to you. We do these things, it gets the project done, it closes the loop, it makes it happen, but not everyone thinks like you do. You got to slow down and help people understand, unless you're in a dynamic where they just have to obey, like the military as an example. You're probably going to have buy-in from the people that you're leading or working alongside. And so I think slowing down and helping contextualize and explain to people your decisions is another challenge that you might have bringing a project to fruition.
I think another piece, and just to give a little bit of context between how, say, ETJs and EFJs work, is to remember that extroverted thinking, which would be the driver process for both the ETJ types, it tends to be a proactive process. It tends to want to get something done, so it creates a project, and it will maintenance if required. It has no problem with maintenancing, but it's usually like it sees something that needs to be built and then it goes and tries to build it. Whereas both EFJs lead with extroverted feeling, which is more of a responsive process, which means that usually there's a lot of need for feedback from other people. It's responsive because it's looking specifically for the needs of others in order to mobilize. And so when you're looking at what might be frustrating you, even though we talked about EJs, all four EJ types having very similar frustrations, the truth is that there's going to be even more of a nuanced difference between ETJs and EFJs, which is that for ETJs, you're probably going to have to do what Joel recommended, which is check in with people, make sure people understand why you're doing what you're doing, getting buy-in, that sort of thing, because that's going to be more of a blind spot for you. For EFJs, it's not getting sucked into this perpetual human need machine, right? Where you get so into that hamster wheel of just getting needs met, and then never seeing a bigger picture and kind of slowing down enough to go, okay, I seem to be putting out people's fires all the time. What are some of the actions I could take that would maybe not require me to be so responsive to all the little minutia, needs, and maybe create more systems where people are just naturally getting their needs met. They don't require me as much. Maybe give myself a little bit of space so that all of my actions are higher leverage, and I'm not just in this perpetual, human need machine. So both types will have slightly different, of those four types, The two that are ETJs are even so going to have slightly different things that will blindside them than EFJs. But on the whole, it's usually about slowing down, getting a bigger picture, checking in with yourself, and giving yourself a little bit of time to make sure that all of the things that you're doing are what you want to be doing.
Yeah, again, these are general suggestions if you're going to bring projects to fruition. Obviously, we're Personality Hacker. We understand that you have a unique personality just in the 16 types in the Myers-Briggs system, and then you bring a lot of skills and nuance and culture and experience and age and all of these other things to the table. These are principles that can help you calibrate if you're thinking about projects. So just take that into account as well. And by the way, if you're new and you don't have any idea when Antonia or I mention extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking, what are they talking about? It's actually something technically called cognitive functions. And there's a great article and podcast on this on our website, personalityhacker.com. You just type in car model into the search feature. That's actually the framework that we use to talk about this. A lot of information can help you get some context about what those things mean that we're talking about. In case you're a brand new listener and you're a little lost right now, don't panic. There's a lot of stuff that can help you make sense of the things we're talking about, just to put you at ease in that framework. Let's move on to the next type. I think the next, you want to stick with the extroverts? Let's stick with the extroverts and go to the EPs.
Sure. Yeah.
So EPs, again, this is the first letter and the last letter of that Myers-Briggs code, that 4-letter code. So these would be ENFPs, ESFPs, ENTPs, and ESTPs. So all the EPs in the Myers-Briggs system. Antonia is an ENTP. I'm an ENFP. So we resonate strongly with obviously what we're going to talk about here. And when we're talking about EPs bringing projects to fruition, one of the greatest things, maybe we're tooting our own horn, one of the good things I think EPs bring to the table is a lot of excitement, a lot of energy. It can often become motivating to other people. There's an energy field that comes from just the amount of there's an ability for EPs to generate from within a metric crap ton of energy. And it burns hot. It can resonate radiate. That's the word I'm looking for. Radiate outward. So other people almost pick up on the energy. They get excited when they're around you. Often I've been around other types and they're like, man, when you're around, I want to get motivated. I want to get into action. This happens for Antonia as well. When we're around people, it tends to be motivating because we have so much energy. We're burning so hot that can be an exciting thing. So if you're another type and you want to use an EP to help get your project going, that's a really good tool to bring an EP on board to help bring that motivation and excitement, because we're good at that part.
Yeah, I don't think an EP should start a project that they're not excited about.
Yeah.
Because you're going to need that honeymoon period of being in love with the concept of the project to get you through the difficult time of the last 20%. That is the worst part for an EP, is the last 20%. And it's because by the time you get to the last 20%, you've already been not wanting to work on the project for at least the last, at the 60% mark. You basically were done at the 60% mark, because at the 40% mark, you were already kind of losing the honeymoon feel. So the life cycle of the project essentially looks like completely in love, don't want to do anything else, massively excited. And then you get to the 40% and you're like, okay, I did this. This was fun. This was awesome. What else is there to do? And then the people around you, possibly your team, or maybe you're a solopreneur and so you have to do it by yourself. You're like, okay, but I can't stop at the 40%. So you go to the 60%. You're like, oh, this is awful. Why am I doing this? But you push yourself. You push yourself to get to the 80%. And it's at that moment that your will to live starts to wane. You're like, why? Why do I have to do this at all? And unfortunately, a lot of EPs start really good projects that they never get an ROI for their efforts because they couldn't get past that 80% death knoll.
Yeah.
Like that was the end for them. And so the biggest thing that an EP has to look out for is losing that amazing sense of energy and excitement that they brought to the beginning of the project.
We got a lot of questions about this, the 2 live meetups. There were a lot of EPs there, in particular ENTPs, the question was basically directed to you, Antonia. I get to 80, 90% in a project at work, and I don't care. I just don't care. It might even be my own project. and I cannot care less, but I have to finish it. My boss is expecting that, or my business will close down if I don't. So what do I do? And that was like, we got multiples of those at both locations. How do you make that happen? And I think the challenge there is often too, in the midst of this, is not only do you peter out at the 80% mark, what's often happened is something new and shiny has taken its place, because it's about that next hit. It's about the next honeymoon. It's about the next thing that's coming up. And so time period is difficult. You know, if you can get a project done like in a weekend or a couple weeks for an EP, it's way better than stretching it out over 2 months or a year, because that marathon running is just not going to be our skill set as EPs. So getting things in shorter timelines, creating frameworks or deadlines for yourself where you stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning for 2 weeks straight, you work 12-hour days and you just get it done. That's one strategy to bringing projects to fruition. The principle, though, in this is that, and that's what speaks to it, is focus. I think the principle for EPs is don't get distracted by that shiny object, and don't stretch it out longer than it necessarily needs to. I mean, sometimes you just have to do stuff that you got to do over a long period of time. But the principle is focus can help bring the timelines in shorter and not have your eyes up looking for shiny things around you. You're looking down at the project and continuing to stay focused on that project.
Yeah, so it's basically the same formula as with EJs. EJs need to go to their Copilot process in order to remember to slow down and take in more information and see a bigger picture, and to just give themselves some space to really think. For EPs, they need to go to that Copilot process to get focus. Their Copilot process is going to be either introverted thinking or accuracy, or it's going to be introverted feeling or authenticity. And both of those processes require us to go inward and ask ourselves what really means something to us. What is the thing that we believe is truly important? How are we evaluating this based on our own subjective criteria? And if we can get to that answer, if the project really strikes to the heart of who we are, or if it really just makes sense, like there's nothing else that I would be doing right now because this is the only thing that makes sense to do, then like Joel just mentioned, you're going to be focused. You're going to continue to look at that project, even if it's not particularly fun anymore. It will still be meaningful, and it will have meaning to you as an individual. Now, just like with the EJs, you're going to have slightly different driver processes depending upon your type. So the two ESP types are leading with a process called extroverted sensing, or what we call sensation. And then the two ENP types are leading with extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. And the reason why these styles are different when we're talking about losing motivation is that they lose motivation for slightly different things. The ENP types lose motivation because they want to move on to the next novelty. Exploration wants the next hit of something new, fresh, exciting, interesting. And so the two ENP types need to focus so that they don't see the next shiny object. For ESP types, sensation types, they just want to be active and in their bodies and doing something physical. And it's the very rare project that allows a person to 100% be physical and energized in the project. No matter what you're doing, there's always going to be like paperwork involved, or a moment when you have to sit chained to your desk to do something. And that drives ESPs crazy, having to do all that. They'd rather delegate all of that out and go do something fun or physical or interesting at least. And that is a part of the process for most projects. Most projects, if you can delegate some of the less interesting things to somebody else who finds that thing interesting, that's ideal. But if you've got to do it all on your own, then for all four types, the important thing is that it means something to you as an individual. That if you're an ETP type and you're using introverted thinking as your Copilot, then nothing else besides this makes sense. This is the only thing to make sense to do. Even if it's painful, what else would I be doing? And if you're one of the EFP types, and introverted feeling is that Copilot process, then it's authentic to you. Nothing else would be as authentic or honest to who you are as an individual than this project. So make sure you're choosing your projects outright based on how fun they or interesting they are to you at the beginning to get as much of that energetic boost as possible, and make sure they're resonating with who you are as an individual inside.
Yeah. And there's a little distinction here between the EP types and the EJ types, in that The advice for EJ types, originally the first set we talked about, was slowing down, because your Copilot process is a linear process to some degree. So it's about timelines. It's about understanding and taking in the information stretched out. Where for EP types, it's not so much about slowing down, because I think at the core, EPs are sprinters. They do the best when they're sprinting through a project to some degree. It doesn't mean rushing or leaving details undone. It just means moving at a very good clip. So again, it's not so much about slowing down. It could be slowing down to really get in touch with that introverted process that Antonia's talking about, what makes sense or what resonates with you. But it's actually about keeping on that clip, keeping on the pace you're on, that fast, energetic pace, but just not directing it all over the field. You just stay in one lane and you stay focused and directed at that fast pace. Whereas for EJs, it's maybe not even staying on one track. It is opening yourself up to different viewpoints, different perspectives, and slowing down so you can take all of those in. So there's a little bit of a difference of nuance of the advice here. It might sound like we're giving the same advice, but there's a little bit of a tack difference.
Yeah, I would say EJs are more marathoners and EPs are more sprinters for sure.
Yeah.
And I think the time that an EJ needs to slow down is as they're formulating their plan and as they need to course correct. Because when you get into action, the world has feedback for you as to whether or not this is the right direction to go. So for an EJ, since they're marathoners, they're pretty much always going to be in action. Then the slowing down has to happen in intervals where they take in that information from the outside world and then sit with it and then determine better strategies and course corrections. Whereas for EPs are not marathoners. There are times when EPs are sitting on their butts doing nothing and they're perfectly happy with that. But when they want to get something accomplished, that's when they go into sprinter mode. And that bears out with the science, because for the EP types, their flow states, if you watch their cognitive functions or their mental processes work in flow, they get into flow. It takes a long time to get there. And then once they get there, they burn super hot and they can't get out of flow until all of a sudden it stops. And then it gets difficult to get back into it, which is very much a sprinter style of working with the world. So EPs are sprinters. So just remember that piece. But the part where you have to slow down and do your introverted thinking or your introverted process is before you start the project to begin with. Before you even start it, that's when you have to make sure that this thing aligns with you. It makes sense. So for an EJ, you slow down in intervals as you're doing it. For EPs, you slow down and make sure this is what you want to even start doing. And then once that happens, go into a sprint until it's done.
So let's pivot and talk about the next set, which are the IJ types. So this is, again, that 4-letter code in the Myers-Briggs system. The first letter would be an I, and the last letter would be J. So this is INTJs, ISTJs, INFJs, and ISFJs in the Myers-Briggs system are IJ types. And one of the things that IJ types bring to the table, so when they are doing projects and showing up, one of the great things about IJ's talents is that they are really good at managing that marathon discipline, adding to a project over time. So if you have a project, especially a project that has a long timeline, in general, IJs bring the ability to stay on course and just keep chipping away at that project until it's done. And it's very easy for them to get into that flow and just daily just have that project on their radar. I think that's one of the best things they bring to the table.
Well, and there's also a thoughtfulness that comes with everything they do, like carefulness, thoughtfulness. When they're doing a project, generally most of it is marked by, they can be very detail oriented. That's not something that drives them crazy like it does with us EPs, right? So there's like a detail orientedness in there, and there's a sense of accomplishing the project. They feel very good once it gets done. So that's, an amazing thing that they bring to projects. But the challenge that they experience is starting the project in the first place, because they have either introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives, or they have introverted sensing, or what we call memory, as their driver. So the INJs are introverted intuition, and the ISJs are introverted sensing. And these are processes that want to make sure that they're ready before they take action. They experience a sense of vulnerability in the outside world. Because once something gets inside of them, and that includes something that's exciting, that's a project, that's something that they're going to attach themselves to, a job, an identity around a project or a job. Once that gets inside, they want to make sure that that's something that's safe for them. And so there's a tendency to hesitate before saying yes to something unless they absolutely need to. And so that, I think another part of it is that unlike the EPs that come with all this boundless, internally generated energy, IJs are kind of the opposite. They don't have a lot of natural energy. In fact, energy management is incredibly important to them because of how little automatic energy their bodies produce as a general rule for doing things in the outside world. They have lots of energy for thinking. Thinking is not something that they could do endlessly. But for actual activities in the outside world, there's not a lot of energy there.
I would say, just a nuance to that, I think it's measured energy. I mean, it's not that they couldn't muster it if they really were active or wanting to do something. It's more about they're rationing it to make sure there's always a reserve in case they need to fall back on that, because it's not as easy to generate after it's been burned out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction there to make. And part of the reason is because they don't have the natural boundless energy reserves that an EP does. But if you notice, us EPs, we just start creating that energy and then we drop. And an EJ, like you mentioned, is a lot more thoughtful about how they're going to measure it out. So before saying yes to a project, an IJ is going to make sure that this is something that they want to be a part of. And by doing that, there's a sense of hesitance. There's a sense of holding back. Maybe I shouldn't start that thing, even if it's the desire of their heart. There's always a sense of I'm not ready yet, right? I need to be more prepared. I haven't done all the research I need to do. So again, as the formula bears out, the antidote to this is in their Copilot process. And the Copilot process for all IJ types is either extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, or extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, which, if you notice, was the driver for the EJs. So just like EJs get into action easy, but they need to slow down, IJs are the opposite. They are naturally more metered in their energy management and in their pace, but they usually need to get impetus to get into action. And so tapping into that part of them that gets driven to want to make the outside world fashioned after how it seems that it obviously should be to them, right? Because if you have extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, there's this sense that the world should be operating in certain ways that seem obvious to you, and why aren't they? So getting really into that space of wanting the world to match how you think it should be. And that might sound, I don't know, maybe because I'm a perceiver, I worry that judges will make that or think that sounds like they're taking, like they have hubris, so that they're, maybe taking liberties. But that is that's your talent. Your skill is to know how things should be operating in the outside world. Those things are obvious to you. And so really allowing yourself and giving yourself permission to start mobilizing. And remember, with EJs, the reason why they need to plan slowing down in intervals is because the world will give them feedback to course correct. It's similar with IJs. Once you get into action, that action will give you an opportunity to have outer world feedback, and you also can course correct as you go. You don't have to have the entire thing planned out beforehand, or you don't have to have all the T's crossed and the I's dotted. Sometimes for IJs, done is better than perfect, and that includes getting into action. Like your planning might not have to be complete, and you have this master map completely designed. Like it's okay to start down the track and have most of it planned, and then allow yourself some outer world feedback to course correct, just like the EJs were doing.
Frameworks can also be helpful here for you as an IJ. If you have, especially for ISFJs and ISTJs, looking at templates and frameworks that you can rely upon. Okay, well, how has this been done before? That can be empowering because then you have a starting place. It's so hard, we talk about projects. It's like, say the project is a white blank piece of paper in front of you. Just like for a writer to sit down and write to a blank piece of paper, sometimes a template or some words on the paper already can prime the pump to get going. So for you, especially, again, if you're an ISTJ or an ISFJ, having a template in front of you of how it has been done before can be very helpful to get that project done. So you know what kind of ways you're going to be expected to show up for that project. And I think for INTJs and INFJs, one of the challenges is you have the ability often to really look into the future and project where things are going. And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, often you're right. But sometimes that can stop you from getting started because you're like, well, I could see where this is going to go. So if I bring this project into fruition, it's going to cause all this other stuff to happen, or it's going to not get done because of this reason. And life surprises you sometimes. You're pretty good at guessing the future, and yet getting into action can bring a lot of surprises and interesting things happening that you didn't predict and you didn't plan for. So getting into action there and looking at the future, but not letting that stop you from getting into motion or into action can be really powerful for bringing projects into the world.
Yeah, and that actually might even be a scary phrase. Like, the world will surprise you. I don't think IJs like surprises very much.
Of course.
But to speak to your point, Joel.
Surprise you pleasantly is what I mean.
That is one piece of it, is that sometimes it can be better than you think it's going to be. And the other piece of it is that you will never be fully prepared. The world will always surprise you. But every time you get a new surprise, you're ready for the next one down the road because you're a little bit more prepared. And then the world stops surprising you as much.
Great point.
Right, because now you have acclimated to the kinds of surprise that the world tends to throw at you. So the only way to be truly prepared is to get into action. And that means you'll be prepared for the next time, but you'll never be prepared for this time fully. So get into that Copilot process and really get into that sense of action. Now, again, you were basically speaking to this, but there's going to be slightly different challenges an INJ will be experiencing than an ISJ. INJs are using introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives, and ISJs are using introverted sensing or memory. And INJs, it's going to be about future pacing, being able to predict or run enough simulations about what the future is holding that they're making wise choices with their energy management to not get into the wrong situation or even relationship or whatever it is. For an ISJ, it's more about fearing the unknown. It's about stepping into a situation where they just can't possibly predict what's going to happen, and they have no certainty that they're going to be ready for it. And they generally stick to things that they have some familiarity around. So for these styles, it's still going to be that extroverted thinking or the extroverted feeling that's really the impetus or the push, the motivation. For extroverted thinking, it's things just need to get done. So you might just have to get into action. And for extroverted feeling, it may be that that responsiveness we talked about before for the EJs. For extroverted feeling, they're responsive to people's needs, and sometimes you just need to get into action in order to meet those needs. So again, even though there's going to be slightly different things that are what may be holding you back a little bit, there's a nuance to the trepidation. It's still the same answer, getting into that Copilot process.
Yeah. So let's talk about the final grouping of personality types. We've talked about 12 different types now. EJs, EPs, IJs. Now let's talk about the IPs. So in the Myers-Briggs system, the first letter I, last letter P, INFP, ISFP, ISTP, and INTP. One of the things that IPs bring to the table is this sense of stick-to-itness and relentlessness. When an IP has made up their mind to do something and bring a project into fruition, they may not know how to do it. They may not have cooperation. Their life might be threatened, and yet they will soldier on as long as it takes until they either accomplish the mission or they die trying. That's how much strength of stick-to-itness and like almost like a conviction IPs can bring when they're making projects happen. Now, there's a dark side to this.
Well, it just like with all of the types, there's something that, it's like what supports you also crosses you.
Dark side might be too strong.
Yeah. I mean, it's the dark side in the same way that EPs can't get past the 80% mark. That's the dark side of being an EP. But for IPs, it's that they need the motivation. They have to want it. And if they don't want it, I mean, it's almost like a toggle switch. It's off or on. If it's on, like, they are water. You cannot stop them. They go up, around, over, through. They just beat you down. Like, there is no stopping an IP that is on mission. But if they're not on mission, it's really hard to get the IP to want to do anything. It's like, well, why even bother? And who cares if it happens?
You don't mean ultimate life mission. You mean like project mission. Like getting this thing done.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because IPs lead with if you're an ITP, it's introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. If you're IFP, it's introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. Now, remember, we told EPs to go to that space because that was what's going to give them focus and identity, and the thing that makes them want to not go chase shiny objects, but just really, really hunker down and have this thing be a part of who they are and want to complete it. Well, that's borrowing from the strength of an IP. Introverted thinking, or accuracy, or introverted feeling, or authenticity. These are things that motivate us because they're a part of who we are or how we see ourselves. They're a part of our identity and our integrity. And so for an IP, regardless of whether or not it's striking them as like the only thing that makes sense, or if it's striking them as the thing that helps define how they see themselves or their identity, the thing has to strike that. And that's hard to do if you're not throwing yourself in the path of new opportunities. So just like with everyone, the formula is to go to that Copilot position. The Copilot position for the ISPs is extroverted sensing or sensation. And for the INPs, it's extroverted intuition or exploration. And if you remember, that was the driver for the EPs. And we talked about how that just makes you go want to do stuff, right? Like you get into that as EPs, we get into, so many new challenges, and we just want cool stuff to happen, and we burn hot, and we just want to make all these neat new possibilities unfold, and then we lose our gumption. For IPs, getting into some of that in their Copilot process of like, anything is possible, and look at the cool things we could build, and getting into that sense of life is full of possibilities, and let's start to burn hot, and let's be sprinters, and let's go to it. That's the space where they'll find their motivation. The challenge is that for IPs, what they have a tendency to do is they have a tendency to find comfort zones. And a comfort zone for an IP is basically the thing that will rob them of their motivation faster than anything else. So for IPs, it's incredibly important to get outside of your comfort zone. Just like with IJs, the fears or the trepidation might be different, but for the IJs, that they don't want to make themselves vulnerable, and so they kind of hesitate and hold back. For them, it's about getting into that space of like, no, things have to happen, so I'm going to go do it. For IPs, it's like, oh, I just don't want to get out of my comfort zone because that doesn't feel good. But the only way to really get into that space where you make stuff happen is to force yourself outside of comfort zones and get into that space of, if you're an INP, novelty and newness and excitement and what ifs and like, let's throw spaghetti against the wall and see what happens, and cool conversations with whiteboards in the background with groups of people idea generating. Or if you're an ISP, it's like, get into action, get physical, like remember how exciting the world is, get an adrenaline rush, get out there and get in your body. But regardless, it's about getting out and getting into a space where you can remember how exhilarating life is.
Yeah. So if you're at work or your career or your job or you own a business and you're an IP, sometimes it can be difficult, again, to find the motivation in the first place. When you have the motivation, you might be unstoppable. But how do you find the motivation? Well, you're going to have to find ways to get into that extroverted process, that Copilot that Antonia just talked about. And that can be something that's a challenge, because sitting still, you're never going to find the motivation. The muse will not strike you sitting, waiting to get the inspiration. You're going to have to create the inspiration, or at least create the ability to have the inspiration strike you by moving into the outside world. At work, that might mean something like, if you can, moving your office to a different environment, or structuring your schedule in your day a little differently, or having someone else give you, some required motivation, like I need this on my desk by tomorrow, and then you find a creative way to make that happen. So you tether that to other motivation, but it's basically getting up and start into action, and then the motivation will come from action. It's not going to be the other way around for you. You're tempted to want to wait to move till you have that. You're going to have to move regardless.
And I think with all 16 types, the thing that is up to us as individuals is to help create a context that is conducive to our personality type, because the world won't do that for us. Like, the world is never going to create a context that's perfect for us. And if that has happened to you, you just lucked out. Like, you just happened, if the world just went, hey, you're this type, and we're just going to create a beautiful context that is perfectly ergonomic with your personality type, that was sheer dumb luck. Most people are not in positions or situations that are conducive to how their type works. So we have to do that for ourselves. We have to find careers, and we have to find positions and jobs, and we have to talk to our bosses, and we have to maybe even leave the comfy job and go start our own business or whatever it is. We have to do that for ourselves because the world is not really interested in catering to us. We have to make sure that we're carving out our own niche. So regardless of what personality type you are, remember that it's up to us to create a context or an environment that will let us shine, that will utilize what we understand and know about our type, the things that will get us into our flow with our driver process, and the things that will give us permission and won't fight us going to our Copilot. If the world is fighting you going to the Copilot, you won't go there because why would you? It's already work. If the world is fighting you going there, why would you do that? So make sure you're in an environment that's conducive to working with how you know that you are naturally wired. And of course, that is easier said than done, but it's because I've done it and I know the work that goes into it and I know it's possible. You do too, Joel. We both created an environment that allows us to be in our flow and in our growth states as much as possible. And that wasn't how our lives were up until we started actively doing it. All of the time, every job I've ever had was definitely pulling on my 3-year-old and my 10-year-old. Every single job I had would have loved for me to be an ISFJ. And so I had to create a world that celebrated me being an ENTP. So you might just have to do that. You might just have to, take life by the balls and make it do the thing you need it to do in order to really bring out the best.
Yeah, and I think in our younger years, we tried a lot of that. We tried whatever we could to bring projects and things to fruition. And eventually, the two of us said, the only way we're going to actually have the ultimate motivation is for us to be in control. So we started our own business. We've started multiple businesses, but this is the one we're doing now that has become the most successful business we've done because we realized that we had to create the world that was going to make more sense to us because we're wired very differently. And that might be where you're at right now. I mean, you might be in a situation, you're listening and you're saying, you guys have no idea. I'm this certain type, whatever it is, type A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. And I'm in this context of this, and there's no compatibility here. Well, that might mean that, I was talking with an INFP, a young woman who's an INFP that came to our meetup in Atlanta, and she was talking about she's in a certain career where she is overwhelmed. I think she's a first responder, and she's overwhelmed by emotions all the time as an INFP. She leads with a process technically called introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it authenticity. It's about what feels right, inner alignment. Oftentimes you resonate with the struggles of other people, and at work, it requires her as a first responder to shut off her feeling process and just be pragmatic and get the job done. Because somebody's bleeding out, they might have a cut on them or have an injury she's got to go ahead and attend to. And she said, how can I do what you've talked about, Joel? You can manipulate your emotions and get into different emotional states. And I gave her some ideas and some tips on this. And then eventually, I always get my best ideas sometimes after I talk to somebody. I thought later that night, well, actually, the thing you really need to change is the structure of what you're doing in the first place, because your job is requiring you to show up in a way that's not your best self every day all the time. So if there's a way to pivot from that, if I could talk again to her, I would talk to her about potentially figuring out a completely different career path using maybe the same skill sets that would help her get the things done or the projects and bring things forward and then still live in congruency with who she is and how she shows up to the world. So you might be in a context where that's the case too. It's just never going to end up working out for you. And you know that deep in your heart. And the thing you have to do is get to a different circumstance that will allow you to be your true self. I think that's something to definitely take into account as we talk about this.
Yeah, and not to say that you can't be a first responder in an INFP, but
of course,
it's just a matter of recognizing what is working well with how you're wired. And you have to determine that on an individual basis because we're more than our Myers-Briggs type. We're a lot of different nodes in the system running, right? We're a lot of different components. And so because of that, your individual situation may vary. But once again, it's a matter of understanding more how you're wired and then taking that information and then matching it to all of the other things you know about yourself and creating an environment that will allow you to become the best version. I mean, I knew what you meant, Joel. I just,
I'm glad you said that.
I just can see an INFP early responder writing in and being like, well, I have a great time at this position. It's like, and I'm sure you do. You probably do have a great time because of all the other aspects of who you are as well. But
of course.
I do want to make a comment too that I'm not usually very pitchy, but we do have a program that we recorded. It's a bonus called Motivation and Types, or Types in Motivation. It's a bonus with our owner's manual program. And I know a lot of people struggle with understanding motivation in themselves and understanding like how they can be motivated based on how they're wired. And we recorded that bonus as a value add to the owner's manual program, which I already think is a great program. So if that's something that's interesting to you, if you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into how types get motivated, then my recommendation is to go check that out.
Yeah, so the owner's manual program, that's a bonus with the program. It's not its own set. So the thing you'd want to look for is owner's manual on our website, and then that bonus, motivation and type, or type and motivation. I forget how it's phrased.
I don't remember either.
It's a bonus in that program. Is
exactly.
What you're talking about. Yeah,
right.
I think we did that like last year. That was a great program. We recorded it live with a virtual audience. It was a really good experience, I think, going through that material, and it goes into more of the motivations behind some of the stuff we talked about today.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more of a deep dive. Today was couched in the framework of at your career, at your job, getting a project done. And that's more motivation in general for whatever you're doing in life. So I think I agree. I think that's a good resource if you're interested to go check out.
Yeah, and the full name of the program is Your Personality, the Owner's Manual. We call it Owner's Manual between us, but I just realized that the full name is Your Personality, the Owner's Manual, and it's a bonus that comes along with that suite. So
yeah. So we've talked about bringing projects into the world as EJs, as IJs, as EPs, as IPs. What do you think? Does this resonate with you? If you're obviously you're one of these types, because we talked about all 16, the framework of these 4 clusters. So you're one of these types. What resonates with you? What questions do you still have? What comments do you have? What stories do you want to tell us and the community? We'd love to hear from you. Head over to personalityhacker.com. Leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast, and we can get a discussion going around these ideas and these topics. The other place you might want to check out, you should check out, if you want to join a community of people who are interested in personal growth, understanding models and frameworks of human development, all of these things we talk about, like Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, Graves model, et cetera, head over to facebook.com/personalityhacker. Or you can also join us at twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK. They wouldn't let us put the full name in there, so just HACK. Join the community, make yourself heard, make yourself known. We have a great growing group of people there that you should be a part of. We want your voice represented, so come over and join that with us and make your voice heard.
Yeah, and if you like this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you would be willing to, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. See you then.